Thus far in class, we've talked about how much energy the world uses and how about 85% of that energy comes from fossil-based fuels. We're not going to talk about coal in this class, and you know that coal varies widely across the different economies as to how much energy it provides, but it's probably fair to say that oil and gas provides about half of the world's energy. And we're going to focus in this class to learn more about oil and gas and the industry that surrounds the production of oil and gas. I had you read chapter 1 from the prize because I think it's important for you to understand the very beginnings. It's interesting to me to see how much the oil industry today is like the oil industry was in 1859 and in those early years of that first well. You read about the story, but you don't really get this idea of where the oil production began. It was here in very northwestern Pennsylvania. Notice the proximity to the Great Lakes. And so if you've ever wondered why there's so many refineries up in the Great Lakes areas, there you have your answer. When we come into class, we'll be talking more about what we learned from those first oil wells. So be ready to have that discussion. We were not going to talk additionally in class about Standard Oil, but the story of Standard Oil is important to the history of the oil and gas industry. So Standard Oil is where a famous American, John D. Rockefeller, made his gazillions of dollars. He had a partner in that industry called Henry Flagler, although I guess he didn't get as rich or something. What's curious is that Standard Oil really began in the downstream business. Now remember these terms, upstream, and it's important that you remember these terms. Upstream is the exploration production side. Midstream is the transportation side. In the United States, that's a lot of pipelines. And downstream is the refining and then the marketing side. In other words, turning the oil into gasoline and then having the places to go buy that gasoline. But they started in the downstream industry, and that's curious. But if you think about it, the downstream industry is a great place to control the rest of the industry because oil is not useful until it's refined. So if you control the refineries, you can control a lot of the industry. What Standard Oil was really good at, or what their core competence was they were just very efficient. Rockefeller was put off by the booms and busts in the oil industry, and he thought surely this could be managed better, and in fact, he did that. So what they were ruthlessly efficient toward was trying to stabilize production and make sure everything operated as efficiently as possible. But in 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was a monopoly, and that was even by that time their share of the refining industry was on the way down. But they directed its dissolution. If you look at the names of the companies that Standard Oil was dissolved into, you see that a lot of those are famous companies even today. And you'll also see when we look later on at some of the consolidation in the industry that these companies were important for many years thereafter. And specifically, these companies were important as oil was discovered around the country. We're going to take just a brief moment to look at Texas. The first big gusher, and that is a picture of Spindletop in 1901. There have been other places oil had been discovered in Texas, but this was one of the gushers. Coming up and making it relevant to us, in 1907, natural gas was discovered in Petroleum. If you're not familiar with the Wichita Falls area, that's about 20 miles to the east of Wichita Falls. And then 4 years later, the Electra field was discovered. This is where a lot of the people who made Wichita Falls famous had fields, and there are still oil being produced out of that field. I think I've mentioned to you that my wife and I are small owners in a small package of wells, and they're in what would be considered the Electra area. 7 years later, oil was discovered in Breckenridge, which is southwest of us, but very importantly in Burke-Burnett. This is a picture from that era in Burke-Burnett. Notice how closely the rigs are spaced together. And if you're from this area and you've wondered why Burke-Burnett has the nickname Boomtown Burke-Burnett, now you know. What was key is notice that I haven't had Wichita Falls on this map, but a lot of the businessmen who were doing oil work up in Burke-Burnett operate out of Wichita Falls. So that's our tie. And then a couple of years later, in 1920, oil was discovered for the first time in the Permian Basin. And as we've already seen, but we'll talk about a lot more in this class, the Permian Basin is one of the epicenters of the oil and gas industry today. And so that was its first discovery. A very, very critical discovery was made in the 1930s in something that was called the Black Giant. So all of the discoveries prior to the Black Giant were relatively small scale. And what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm just going to capture for you on the screen a part of the YouTube video that talks about the Black Giant so you get a sense of its contribution. We'll address that in our next video.